we know that you have been an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. I wanted to know how was it look like economically in Russia in those days?
Well, at the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in a state of decay and really a state of collapse. The command system wasn't a good system after all, so the Soviet command economy could fight a war, could develop a military industrial complex, but could not really develop a civilian economy. And this was felt in the 1970s and the 1980s. Then in the 1980s, several things happened. Gorbachev eased up on the political control, so he started to open up the harsh system and democratize. But in a command economy, that meant that there were no commands anymore. And so the command economy was not functioning, but there was no market economy. So things started to really get into disarray. A second thing that happened was that world oil prices fell. Russia was a petrostate. The Soviet Union was a petrostate. And so with the fall of oil prices, Gorbachev kind of walked into an even deeper economic crisis. And then the third thing that happened was that he borrowed on international markets. This is familiar for Brazil also, for a few years trying to close the gaps that had opened up. And by 1990, you had a failed economy, a collapsed command system, a government without revenues, and a debt crisis. And Russia was starting to enter a kind of full-fledged economic collapse. And it wasn't completely unlike, say, Brazil's crisis in the 1980s or similar kinds of events, but it was worse because it was after 75 years of the Bolshevik system, and it was not an effective economy. I came in at that moment saying, okay, let's try to figure out a way out of this mess. And my main advice, which I had given in Poland starting in 1989, was make internal reforms, but at the same time, let's get help from the international system, from the United States, from Europe, from the international institutions, so that this period is at least cushioned so that it doesn't go into a full-fledged financial crisis. But all of those recommendations were rejected basically by the White House because the U.S. was not really interested in helping the Soviet Union, certainly not. It wasn't interested in even helping Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. It was interested in a U.S.-led unipolar world. So nobody wanted to make any major effort to help cushion the collapse that was underway in Russia. So I tried for 2 years to convince the White House, the IMF, Brussels, you got to do something different. You have to help. But it was useless. And in the end, I resigned in 1993, feeling that Russia was going into a deeper spiral of crisis, which indeed it did.
Well, before that, we have to back up just a little bit. Ronald Reagan came into power as the American president on a very strong anti-communist, anti-Soviet Union platform. In fact, he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And he used this platform to justify the rebuilding of the American military, both in terms of conventional power in Europe, but also our strategic nuclear capabilities, and indeed our intermediate range nuclear force, the Pershing II missile, the ground launched cruise missile, et cetera, came into being under Reagan. Reagan's administration was staffed with people who mirrored this approach, a very anti-Soviet approach, anti-communist approach. Even when Ronald Reagan finally had a moment of visionary insight and decided that to save the world, it might be a good idea to get rid of some of the most dangerous nuclear weapons in existence, and worked with Mikhail Gorbachev to sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty. They signed it in December of 1987. His decision to do this was not extremely popular amongst the conservatives. I can say without a shadow of doubt that George Herbert Walker Bush, his vice president, was not happy about this. And many of the people that advised George Herbert Walker Bush were not happy about this. The reason why I bring that up is the implementation of the INF Treaty began in July of 1988. 1 month prior, in June, Ronald Reagan visited Moscow, and he met with some Soviet students at Moscow State University. And he was asked the question, do you still view us as the evil empire? And he said, no, that's the past. I view you as friends. We can be friends. And that's what we should be working for. That's a visionary statement. But it was made by a leader who would be out of office in 6 months. We had elections coming in November of 1988. The same month that Reagan visited Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev convened the 19th All-Party Union Conference. I know that's an eye-rolling Soviet-era type statement, but it was very important. All-Party Union conferences were very rare. The last one that had been convened had been done in 1941, June 1941, right before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The purpose of this conference was to initiate a new revolution, a revolution that replaced communist authority with a new Soviet democracy. He talked, it initiated a process that ultimately resulted in elections for the first time in Soviet history. Elections that were held in March of 1989 for this People's Congress. They were electing, people's deputies. And then the Congress would elect a Supreme Soviet, would be like a Senate, and then president would be appointed. The president turned out to be Gorbachev. And the reason why I bring this up is that Gorbachev initiated this revolution, but he desperately needed a Ronald Reagan type leader who would be his friend, who would work with him, who would help the Soviet Union transition through a very difficult time. But what he got was a Cold Warrior named George Herbert Walker Bush, who had surrounded himself with Cold Warrior-like people, James Baker, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, people of this nature, who were not thrilled about helping the Soviet Union. They didn't know what was going on. They were unsure. Was Gorbachev serious about these changes, or was this just another ploy by the Soviets to get the United States to bail them out? So while Gorbachev was begging for continued disarmament, which would free him from the defense industry and the need to continue to produce all of these strategic missiles, if he and the United States could agree on reductions, then he could start the business of converting defense industry. And then he could attract investors who would help underwrite this. But George Herbert Walker Bush didn't give him an arms control treaty until late in the game, July 1991. That's when they signed, actually the last day in July 1991. A little more than 2 weeks later, there was a coup that threw Gorbachev out. There was no economic investment, which meant Gorbachev was left trying to restructure a economic system that could not be restructured. When in 1989, December 89, they transitioned from the old state budgetary methodologies to gosraschot, self-financing. there was no business. Factories like the Vodkinsk machine building plant where I was working suddenly went from having state money to pay the salaries of their employees to having no money. And no money meant no money not just for the salaries, but for everything. Because Vodkinsk was a factory town. The schools were paid by the factory. The stores were stocked by the factory. The roads were maintained by the factory. The housing was maintained. Everything was done by the factory. Now the factories broke. And that was the whole country. The whole country was broke. Gorbachev desperately needed Western investment. And Bush didn't allow the investment to come because he didn't trust them. So when the Soviet Union fell, collapsed, who stepped in? Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had a checkered relationship with the United States. He tried to push his way through and become more important than he was. When he became the president of the Russian Federation, he wanted to get the United States to believe that he was more important than Gorbachev. He had a drinking problem. There were people who were unhappy with that aspect of it. He was an unknown quantity. Many people believed that he was not going to be an effective leader and that he would be pushed aside and the communists would come back. The military would assert its people. There was no trust in Yeltsin. So even when Gorbachev fell, these cold warriors surrounding George Herbert Walker Bush continued to be very skeptical about Russia. And many of them believed rather than helping Russia rebuild, that it was in our best interest to keep Russia down. And these people won out. So no, there would be no investments into Russia. What we were going to do is exploit Russia. We were going to facilitate the economic pillaging of Russia, where we took Russia's resources out, but we didn't allow Russia to grow up, where we empowered the oligarchs to rob Russia blind. See, it was easier to deal with the oligarchs because we understand greedy capitalism. It's one thing to give money to a government you don't understand, Boris Yeltsin and whatever this new Russian government was, to fund a nation we didn't understand. Because, even during Soviet times, the idea of how Russia functioned still escaped many analysts who were supposed to be experts on Russia. We didn't understand it, so we weren't willing to give money to it because we had no idea how that money was going to be spent. And as I said, maybe it was a trick to bring communists back, to empower the military. So we made a decision, deliberate decision, to keep Russia down, and we reflect that. Remember when James Baker gave his promise to Mikhail Gorbachev, not 1 inch eastward about NATO, not 1 inch eastward, a promise. He came back and he told the National Security Council, he gave that promise. They said, not so fast. We actually want to expand NATO because we want to keep Russia down. We want to control Russia. We want to contain Russia. And that's why Jeffrey Sachs' proposals were rejected, because what Jeffrey Sachs claims to be pursuing back then, I can't vouch for him. I don't know personally, but what he's telling you is that he was a proponent of providing economic aid to Russia to fix the Russian economy, that he was told no. And I'm telling you that if that is true, what he's saying there is true, the reason why he was told no is because it was not U.S. policy to fix the Russian economy. It was U.S. policy to destroy Russia. And that's what we were trying to do from day one of the new Russian Federation. We didn't want them to get stronger. We wanted them to get weaker. The comment you refer to, I believe, comes from a 2005 speech that Putin delivered to the Russian politicians. And what he said was that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest calamities in modern history. Not the greatest. There's a lot of people that misrepresent this. One of the greatest. But then he explained it. Because overnight, tens of millions of Russians were without a home, were without anything. They were homeless. And he said this was a failure on the part of Russian leadership, a failure on the part of history. So there's your answer. He gave this statement in 2005, 6 years into his presidency. And it was commenting on the fact that the collapse of the Soviet Union disenfranchised tens of millions of Russians, Russian-speaking people, ethnic Russians who no longer had a homeland. And they were oftentimes found residing in countries that didn't want them there, that were resentful. 1 minute, they're part of the Soviet Union. The next minute, they're nothing. And he said that this was unacceptable, and he had a duty and responsibility as the president of Russia to care for these people. You know, and when you talk, you say, well, why would he say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a collapse? Vladimir Putin's made it clear that he's no fan of Soviet authority. He doesn't long for the return of the Soviet Union. What he does is resent the decade of the 1990s. Ask any Russian who lived in the former Soviet Union during that period of time how life was, how difficult life was, how you went from being a citizen of a superpower to being thrown away, cast away by a society that was unable to sustain itself, let alone sustain you, and the struggles of the average Russian trying just to survive. You know, this was the Russia that Putin lived in. This is the Russia that Putin inherited in 1999. And this is the Russia that Putin saved, because there's no doubt about it. If you compare and contrast Russia today with what it was when Vladimir Putin inherited it, today is so much better. On any, you can't find a single, I challenge anybody, a single measurement that says, no, Russia was better off in 1999 than it is today. Not a single one. On every level, Russia is better. Could Russia have done better? Perhaps. You know, but remember that Putin has been opposed by the West from almost day one. They didn't want a strong Russian leader. They wanted a weak Russian leader like Boris Yeltsin. They wanted somebody who would allow the West to continue to come in and economically exploit Russia for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the average Russian citizen. They wanted somebody to come in and destroy, I got a dog, destroy Russian democracy. You know, people say, well, you know, Putin isn't a real democratic leader. I say, really? Has he been given a chance? Because from day one, the West went in and tried to buy a Russian opposition. The British intelligence services are on record, caught cold-handed, sending money to political opponents. In Brazil, would you like it if the CIA came in and started paying your political opponents? No, you'd call that outside interference. The West has been interfering in what we call Russian democracy. But you can't have a democracy if the opposition isn't the voice, the genuine voice of the people, but rather the voice of Russia's foreign opponents. So it's hard for Putin to, A, struggle against this foreign interference, and B, at the same time, try to build a viable opposition. Because every time somebody comes up and says, I'm opposed to Vladimir Putin, the CIA comes in with briefcases full of money and corrupts that process. So it's not Putin's fault that there isn't a viable democracy. It's because the West doesn't want a viable democracy. Why do I say that? Because Vladimir Putin is a good leader. He's done good things for Russia. Maybe he's been in power too long. Again, that's not his fault. You know, when the last time he tried to bow out of the election process, he recognized that there was nobody ready to replace him. That if he left, the people that would replace him would be corrupted by the West. So if the West stops corrupting Russia's democracy with money, with foreign influence, and allows a Russian opposition to grow on its own, then there could be another leader. Putin would step aside. I can imagine that at the age of 70, there are things he'd rather be doing than running a country. I think he'd rather be pensioner, enjoying retirement, fishing, riding horseback shirtless, doing things that Putin does. But instead, he is condemned to govern a country that has no viable political alternative to him, not because he is suppressing it, but because the West is corrupting it.
How was it look like for Russians after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
It looks terrible. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there was no real plan as to what to do about the constituent republics there were 15 republics in this union of Soviet socialist republics, and they were sort of let drift off. The ironic thing is that President George H.W. Bush favored them kind of staying together, hang in there together and figure out how you're going to resolve all this stuff. But no, it was sort of simultaneous. And as Gorbachev left the scene, Yeltsin came in. Now, Yeltsin was poison for Russia. He hobnobbed with Wall Street, with the so-called Harvard boys, and with the rich people in Washington, and plundered the Russian economy, sold off the state assets at a minimum price. The result was, and not many people know this, but if memory serves, between 1991 and 1995, during those Yeltsin years, the expectant age of death among Russian males went from 63 years old to 57 years old. Now, where do I get that figure? From the World Bank, okay? It's valid, it's authentic. I know of no other case where a country like Russia would suffer this kind of, 6 years down from 63 to 57 years old when you expect it to die? In 4 years, people were dying. People were hungering in the street, but other people would get really, really wealthy. Those are what we call the oligarchs. Some of them were Russian, some of them were Ukrainian. A lot of them were from Harvard, Columbia, and Washington, D.C. So, point of my remarks here is that in answer to your question, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was a very bad thing for the Russian people. Now, Putin has been quoted as saying one of the worst catastrophes in history has been the falling apart of the Soviet Union. Well, he's not saying that he wants, like the Soviet leaders, he wants to take over the world or even just Europe. He's not saying that. He's saying explicitly that this left tens of millions of Russians outside of the Russian Federation to fend for themselves. And long story short, we get to Ukraine, we could see how that went. They tried to fend for themselves, being maybe 40% of the Ukrainian population. When the West came in, the US particularly, staged a coup in Kiev in February 2014 and marginalized the Russian-speaking population, and worst of all said, let's join NATO, a direct threat, an existential threat to how Putin and the Russian leaders look at the danger from the West.